have the mic. I enjoyed your talk. Could you comment on, you didn't seem to mention Al-Qaeda in your analysis at all, Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Could you comment on reports that Howard Hunt had been granted oil interests in Kurdistan? And what do you see as the likelihood that the al-Maliki government will be replaced by a different, more even-handed regime?
Okay. That's three questions. First of all, the reason I don't talk about al-Qaeda in Iraq is that I think it's a misnomer. There are groups in Iraq that call themselves al-Qaeda, but it's like, I'm a bogeyman, I'm big, I'm mean, and you should be afraid of me. It doesn't have any operational implications that they call themselves al-Qaeda. There may be a handful of people who've come in from Waziristan or something who had a conversation with Ayman al-Zawahiri, but it just doesn't amount to very much. And the U.S. military has 24,000 Iraqis in custody. Altogether, there are 60,000 people incarcerated in Iraq for political crimes. This is enormous. It's only a country of 25 million or 27 million. So it's a very significant percentage that are incarcerated. Of the 24,000 that are incarcerated by the United States, on the order of 17,000 are Sunni Arabs. The rest are Shiites. And the foreign jihadis of the sort that call themselves al-Qaeda, I think 149. I conclude that al-Qaeda is not important, and that what's really going on is the U.S. military is fighting Iraqis and doesn't want to say so. So then they call them al-Qaeda. I've noticed in the press now, every time there's a firefight in Samara or someplace, the U.S. troops killed 14 al-Qaeda fighters. Well, what, did they kite the bodies? Do they look through the pockets? Do they have pictures of Osama bin Laden and lockets around their neck? What does it mean that they're al-Qaeda? I mean, they're Iraqis, they're Sunnis, they're calling them al-Qaeda. And there is a group called the Islamic State of Iraq, which actually does hold territory and is a guerrilla group. And its leaders praise al-Qaeda and say that they're part of al-Qaeda. But again, this is a rhetorical strategy in Iraq. And those are the ones that are declining in favor of the awakening councils. So that's one. The second thing about Hunt, yes, the Hunt oil is losing its bids in Yemen. In the old days, it would have been sunk. The Hunts are very good friends of the Bushes, and they have been saved by the possibility of some bids in Iraqi Kurdistan, which are being let without the permission of the Baghdad central government. So you have George W. Bush coming out in front of the cameras and saying, we support the federal government of Iraq, and you have his buddies and Dick Cheney behind the scenes getting up these oil contracts that don't have reference to the government in Iraq, in Baghdad, and which are going straight to the Kurds. And this is a violation of U.S. policy, but it's happening. And then what was the third?
The likelihood that the al-Maliki government would be replaced by a more promising group.
Well, the problem is the way the Constitution is worded. The largest bloc in Parliament gets to form the government. So the largest bloc in Parliament now and tomorrow and forever will be the Shiites. And so if you got rid of al-Maliki, they would just elect somebody else like al-Maliki. I mean, we've already gone through that. They didn't like Jafri, who was from the Dawa party, and they got rid of him, and so then they elected al-Maliki. But the only way you would get real change is if you went back to the polls, if there was new parliamentary elections. Now, in most parliamentary systems, if the government loses a vote of no confidence, they're general elections. But general elections are hard to hold in Iraq because of, like, the bombs. And so they put in the Constitution that if the government falls, you just have another vote of Parliament. So nothing necessarily has changed in Parliament. So 55 deputies in Parliament could call a vote of no confidence for al-Maliki, and I think he'd lose at this point. But then the president would be forced by the Constitution to go back to al-Maliki's coalition, the United Iraqi Alliance, and ask them to form a new government. So you'd get somebody very like al-Maliki. Yeah.
There were all of these groups So they withdrawn their support
Yes.
from the.
Well, they withdrew their support from the al-Maliki government, but they're still Shiites, and they would be counted in the bloc. In fact, most of them have not said that they formally severed themselves from the main bloc. But you only have to have the largest bloc in parliament. So the Sunnis depends upon how you count. But there are 44 in the Iraqi Accord Front and 11 in the National Dialogue Council. So say 55. And then the Kurds have about 58 if you count the 5 Islamists. And then the Shiites are always going to have more than that. So there's nothing you could do about it. If you unseated Maliki, you'd just get a Maliki lookalike. And it would take 7-8 months to negotiate the new government because they give out the ministries in accordance with the parties and make favors. And so you just have gridlock with regard to politics for a long time. And I can't see in whose benefit it would be to provoke that situation. You certainly wouldn't get a quick new situation.
I'd like to know what's your estimate of the social and economic destabilization and weight onto surrounding countries created by the wars.
The question about the social and economic impact of the Iraq War on neighboring countries is a vivid one. The estimates are 2.2 million Iraqis abroad, of which at least half have been displaced by this war. There were people who had been displaced by Saddam before. Probably 800,000 in Jordan, 1.2 million in Syria, and then there are smaller communities in Lebanon and Egypt. Those Iraqis in Jordan and Syria, remember, Jordan's population is something like 5.8 million. So 800,000 is a very large proportion of the people resident in Jordan right now. It's like 13% or so. And Syria's population, 19 million, so 1.2 million is a good chunk. They have survived so far on stipends from the United Nations Relief Organization, UNHCR. And that money is running out. It may be gone by the end of the year. The Jordanian and Syrian government do not have the resources to essentially put these Iraqi refugees on welfare. The Syrian government doesn't even have the resources to admit them to its schools. The Iraqi refugees in Syria are not having their children schooled. So there is danger of severe malnutrition. There's danger of a lost generation. There's danger of social turmoil. And it's not very unclear where the money is going to come from to take care of all these people. The situation in Jordan doesn't seem to be quite as dire. I think possibly because some of the Iraqi refugees in Jordan are from Dulaim and other tribes that exist in the Jordanian side, and probably the tribal networks are kicking in some help. But there are severe social problems of pauperism. There's potential for homelessness. There's widespread forcing of girls into prostitution. So it is a massive calamity, probably the worst calamity of displacement since 1948, when the Palestinians were displaced from Palestine. And we all know how well that went afterwards. So a lot of us are worried where this thing is going. I don't think it's a long-term problem because obviously Iraq is potentially a very rich country. If you were exporting 2 million barrels a day at $100 a barrel, you could take care of a lot of people. So I think they'll eventually come back, and I think things in the medium to long term will be all right. But we're facing a crunch. We're facing a crisis of how to get through 2008 for these refugees. And I personally believe, and I wish you all would write your congressmen and senators about this, that the U.S. Congress has a responsibility for kicking in some large amounts of money to those refugees because they have been displaced in some large part by our war, and we are taking no responsibility for them. We were on the verge of passing another big supplemental of $100 billion for war material, and we should be able to find $1 billion in there for taking care of these refugees. And if we don't, the contribution of this problem to further destabilization of the region could be immense.